Our next presentation is also online, and it is Scott Hill from St John of God Hospital. And the presentation is called Partners' Experiences of How Alcohol Use Disorder Impacts on Trust in Couple Relationships, a Qualitative Study.
Thank you for inviting me to share my research to you guys on St. John of God Research Study Day. For those who don't know me, my name is Scott Hill and I'm a senior social worker in St. John of God's Hospital, where I've been working for the last 7 years and a little bit more. As you can see in my title, my research was Partners' Experiences of How Alcohol Use Disorder Impacts on Their Trust in the Couple Relationship. And it's a qualitative study. The study, the data was collected sort of 2020 and the start of 2021. And the background really for me was that I've been working as a senior social worker in the addiction team in John of God's Hospital. And my role would often be the interplay between the patients getting addiction treatment and their families and often their spouses or partner relationships. And many a time the theme of trust would come up. Many patients would ask me, Scott, how can I get trust back? Or Scott, I wish they could just trust me again. Family members would be a mix of feelings of feeling guilty that they don't trust or feeling warranted not to trust, other times wanting to trust. And both sides would often ask me how to rebuild trust. So I always had an interest in this idea of trust and in the addiction relationship. I was also doing a master's in systemic psychotherapy, and there's an opportunity to do some research there as part of that. So with these hunches and with these ideas, I thought this would be a good topic and to explore and get some data on this as well. Due to the limited time as well, I was very much interested in the partner's experience as well. So it was a real focus on their experiences of it. And if I had more time or resources, I would have been interested to get both sides of this, but that was where the focus was for this study. In looking at the literature, there was a real gap, but there was kind of a gap in between. The first idea was looking at how addiction impacts on the couple relationship, but there was no focus on trust. So there's lots of research that would suggest that addiction has a significant impact on relationships. And often be bi-directional, that often in a couple relationship, if the couple relationship was struggling, often addiction would appear. And then likewise, when addiction was in the couple relationship, that would impact on the relationship too as well in a negative way. But of all those studies, there was no focus specifically on trust. Sometimes it was mentioned as an aspect, but never the focus was on that. So then when I looked at all the trust research, specifically in couple relationships, most of it would have come up in context of like infidelity and those aspects, but there was no focus on substance addiction at all, which was surprising. But also as potential research, this was an opportunity to fill this literature gap. There was one study on by Zitzman and Butler, which looked at how relational trust or how they talked about secure attachment was impacted in the context of pornography use and deception in that context. So a little bit in terms of addiction, but nothing on substance addiction. What's really important in qualitative research is to kind of have a sense of some big ideas, what I would almost call conceptual filters, because I'm going to be getting a lot of data, qualitative data, and how do I find what's nuanced, what's important. So there was these three kind of concepts that kept coming up in all the relational trust idea. When I talk about relational, that trust in that couple relationship. So the first idea is this idea that trust is invisible yet foundational. There was this famous seminal work on trust in a philosophical sense by Annette Breyer, and she said that we inhabit a climate of trust as we inhabit an atmosphere, and notice it as we notice air, only when it becomes scarce or polluted. So the idea that trust is something to be taken granted for, that we don't really see trust. We only notice it when it becomes a problem. And yet all the kind of research on couples and what makes couple relationships satisfying and important would all say that trust is the kind of precondition needed for any meaningful or satisfying relationship. And it's the fundamental principle for making relationships work. So because trust is this kind of invisible yet foundational, it was just important for me when I looked at the data that sometimes the trust might be behind some of the obvious data that's there. What's the kind of driving force there? The second thing is this interesting dialectic with trust, that is this knowing and yet not knowing. it's almost this, we need to have some level of trust to justify why we would trust this person, some information, some knowledge. And yet there's also has to be this gap that trust is there. Otherwise, we wouldn't need trust. We would just have prediction. We'd have the facts that a guarantee. And relationships, there is no guarantee. Just because what someone says, just because what someone did in the past doesn't necessarily mean they'll do that this time. So there always will need to be this gap, this question mark. And so, in some ways, trust begins where prediction ends, and that's another key concept in this idea of trust. The final one, which was very helpful in interpreting the data, was this idea of the 5 components of trust. Tashin, Moran, and Ho, which would have been from an educational background between teachers and students and teachers in other contexts as well, did a massive literature review of all the different literature articles, theoretical articles, and some qualitative and quantitative articles on what trust is, how to define trust, what are the key ingredients in trust. And they came up with these common 5 components of trust. See, benevolence, honesty, openness, reliability, and competence. And all of these are very important in building trust. Briefly, benevolence is kind of on its own. Benevolence is the idea that I trust someone's intentions, I trust someone's motivation is for me, it's good for the relationship, it's loving, it's caring. While the next 2 at the end, they're reliability and competence, they're more, I trust their ability, their instrumentality of trust. So you could trust someone's motivations, their benevolence, it's good for me, but their ability to do that, you may not trust. And then the other 2, honesty and openness, again, quite similar. I suppose honesty is the absence of deception, the absence of lying. Well, openness was more transparency. It goes deeper. It's allowing something into your life more, into the kind of unknown, and bringing that knowledge deeper as well. So I suppose with this theoretical knowledge and with my hunches, what were my objectives in this data and this research? So 2 very simple ones was to understand how this relational trust is impacted by AUD, alcohol use disorder, from the partner's experience and perspective. So very much hearing their story, and the data would be from their perspective and their experience. So how does alcohol addiction impact on that trust? And finally, to understand some of the processes that the partner has experienced, so from their experiences, as helpful in the repair of trust in the couple relationship. So really simply looking at how alcohol use disorder breaks up trust, and also what are some of the things that help repair or rebuild trust. The methodology is qualitative. This is qualitative data, not quantitative data. A lot of the trust in literature would often think about there was a lacking of qualitative data, and because this phenomenon is quite subjective and quite personal and quite relational and multi-dimensional, a qualitative methodology would suit fine for this. Purposeful sampling. So how did I pick the participants? Well, they had to be self-designated as we're in a monogamous relationship, and they'd have to acknowledge that their partner had a diagnosis of alcohol use disorder, and that partner would have been part of a patient of St. John of God's Hospital. So to get that real kind of meaty data, I needed someone lived experiences of being in a long-term relationship with someone alcohol use disorder. So therefore I had to kind of purposefully sample. It wasn't random. And thematic analysis. This is how I was able to analyze the data. I suppose the thematic analysis is just a meta-analysis, which is about identifying and organizing and interpreting kind of key themes. A lot of it is about getting all the data. So I transcribed it myself, got all from the interviews, and analyzing it, and then bringing into clumps, into themes. But it wasn't superficial themes. It wasn't just a summary of the data, but it was trying to get beyond the data or into the data and the meaning behind some of the data, which I'll come to later on. This is just the participant profile. Of course, these are the real names of the participants for confidential reasons, but it gives a bit of human nature to them. Supposed to notice, first of all, that the participants is 6, 5 of them were female, only 1 was male. None of them, currently the partner, had a problem with alcohol, which is quite important through the ethically as well, just safety, but also wanted to get a kind of similarity of when the sobriety was there, what was happening. Most had children, not all, and you can see there yourself any other information that's quite interesting. So the results, I think I'll put them up there. There's four key themes, but they're grouped into two families. The first is the disorientation of trust, how trust begins to go and one's orientation. Do I trust this person? People feel lost. That was often what the kind of sense of it is. And then reorientation, recalibrating, getting trust back. And this is a kind of, as I listened to the participant stories in a narrative way, there was a narrative arc of kind of the starting point was how trust was impacted by the addiction. And then there was this kind of middle part where participants went into rehab, into John of God's, and then post rehab, how did trust come back? So that was kind of it. It wasn't completely chronological in the data. It was often jumped from place to place to place, piece to piece even. But these are their kind of chronological markers. These are the kind of bits that often come in. So we're just going to look at each four. The first one is damaged trust. So this first question of does alcohol use disorder impact on trust, and very much so. And I used the five components of trust to really mine that. I suppose if you think about addiction, there's two kind of relational behaviors that are very common in addiction. One is that compulsive nature of addiction. That's really what addiction is. It's the compulsions are so strong that despite the harm it's causing the person in the addiction, they're still going to do it. And that, I suppose, is a summary of addiction. So that compulsiveness behaviors and also the deceptive behaviors, often because the drive to use means that the person will try to deceive or be deceptive so they can keep using, keep engaging in the substance, or also to avoid conflict because they know at some level this is causing harm. So they need to find ways of doing it. So these behaviors, compulsive behaviors, deceptive behaviors, very common in addiction. You can see how these impact on the five components of trust. But the compulsive behaviors of use, despite the harm it's going, participants would have really questioned: Does this person, can I trust them that they care for me? Are they reliable? Are they competent? Missed appointments, all that kind of stuff, and also deceptive behaviors, openness and honesty. So you can see how some of the quotes here from Audrey, she would have said this is one that really questioned the trust and the benevolence. Do I trust this person's for me? For me, that was soul destroying because he didn't see outside what was going on around him at all, or didn't care. That's how I felt. He didn't care. It was more important to just drink. And so you can see there's a lot of data like this of questioning: Is this person really care for me? Does this person have their motivation intentions? Are they for me? Probably not, based on their behaviors. The lying, I can't even describe to you what it does to you, not being able to trust him. And Jane wasn't the only one. All across the data set would have said lying, these deceptive behaviors have a massive impact on honesty and openness in the relationship of trust. And a third example, he would just say, oh, it's very simple. All I have to do is give it up, you know? But he couldn't do it. And there was almost this resignation, a sigh when you actually heard Ruth say this. So this idea is would impact on the components of trust, would impact on the reliability, the competence. Look, he'd say a good talk, but then he would drink again. So I just couldn't, the reliability and the competence of this person, I couldn't rely on. I couldn't trust that. The second kind of theme was the disordered relationship. I suppose this is not directly related to trust, but a lot of the data came this up. And there's this flexibility in qualitative studies, thematic studies. If a lot of other stuff comes up, it's important to capture it. And it's linked to trust because it's in the context of the relationship. One of the things that came up was this unhealthy symmetrical patterns of withdrawal. So the more the person used the substance, the addiction itself withdrew the person from relational responsibility, withdrew the person from connecting relationships. So they withdrew into themselves, into their addiction. And likewise, the participant, the partner would withdraw away from them. This person doesn't seem to care. I'm going to get on with my own life. This is too hurting. And then the person in addiction would kind of, according to the participants, they would notice this. Well, look, my loved one doesn't seem to care about me, so I'm going to drink further, and so the vicious circle happens. Then other unhealthy complementary roles: the caring role versus the sick role, the worried role invites a kind of careless role. The careless role invites someone being more worried, and that seeking hiding. All of them were very much part of the data that came out. Then when kind of this is now 3 and 4 looking at the reorientation of trust, how trust came back. So what's really important is that sobriety allowed this. Sobriety was so key in that. It allowed the partner separate from the addiction. So this allowed the participant, when they saw their partner not drinking anymore, they began to go, maybe they weren't drinking because they hated me, or maybe they weren't drinking because they just didn't care. Maybe it's something about this addiction, this illness, that they're able to separate it. And that took kind of time. And also then the participant themselves began to have distance from the addiction. So they no longer just focusing on the participant, no longer focusing on the person's addiction, but they're able to kind of focus on their own needs as well. This externalization is really important, it seemed, because this allowed the benevolence that actually the person does care for me and it wasn't their actions. I can't just judge their actions and what they really feel about us in the relationship. And separating the person from the addiction was very important. That seemed to allow trust to come back. And this is a great quote from Owen that really summed this up. And again, there was lots of other examples of this. He said this: yes, it damages trust when that monster of addiction kind of molds with the person. But when it separates, I can see how one can rebuild the relationships. But when it's one of the same, it's really hard to. You see the problem and the person as one. You have to see it as one because the person is hurting you. And of course, in your distress, all the good things you know about that person is consumed by the monster within. Yeah. So I think it helps in the context of trust to see that separation. The final theme is this idea of minding the space. So as well as sobriety, there need to be something about managing risk for trust to come back. The letting go and holding on and the opening up and closing down. And it's just weighing up how to manage risk. But there's this idea that without giving the space and almost the opportunity for the patient to show you can trust me. If I go down to the shops, I won't buy wine. I come back. If you let me drive, I'll come back and not drink. If you let me go to that Christmas party, which was during Christmas, a lot of these interviews happened. I'll come back. I'll be okay. But you got to give me the chance. Otherwise, you won't trust me. So that was going on, where participants were very scared of this at the same time. And so this is a great example of Lane. Again, I was clinging on to him when he came home from rehab, but eventually I had to let him go. And she gave this great example of one day where all these difficult things came for the participant, but he didn't drink. And this sort of risky situation allowed the patient to show that he could be trusted now in his recovery. So that was very important. So in conclusion, with this research, I suppose addiction leads to a breakdown in trust, which leads to a low intimate relationship. There's this idea that all those participants, they all stuck with their patient, but that didn't mean their marriages were happy. A lot of their marriages or the relationships were unhappy. There was a lack of intimacy and vulnerability because addiction came in. But when sobriety came in, it allowed for those more intimate relationships to come back on side. And two key things for trust to come back, according to the participants in the data, was sobriety. Again, sobriety, as I mentioned, is so important. That was almost a foundation for trust to be rebuilt on all those five facets. But also risk. It was very challenging for some participants. Some participants decided to go with a low risk option, which meant that maybe they didn't give the participant as much opportunity to take risks to sow that trust as well. So trust was still quite low. They kept control of the money. They maybe didn't let the participant out too much or kept an eye on them a lot, which allowed trust not fully develop, while others allowed more of the participant to engage in life at a more risky level. And the benefit that was that trust increased, but it was also a worrying time as well and a risky time that the person might relapse as well. But the sobriety and risk are two key factors for trust to come back. There's limitations to the study, of course, very small study. It's not quantitative, it's qualitative. Only 6 participants. The participants themselves, there was a lack of kind of broad sexuality. They were all heterosexual couples, which was a limitation. And time as well. This was just in a moment in time. And it'd be interesting if we'd done further times or kind of 3 different times as well to see if that had a factor too. The contribution to the study, I think one of the key things is it really linked um, the trust and addiction literature. And as I said at the start, there's no known study that's looked specific at how trust is impacted by substance addiction in a couple of relationships. So while this is a very small study, it has contributed in highlighting the importance and relevance of studying trust in the area of addiction studies. I think the 5 facets of trust has been a really helpful theoretical construct, which I think shows its utility in the literature. And it also again highlights the value of understanding trust. Clinically, I think it gives us a deeper understanding of people who work in this profession. It gives us a sense of how trust has been impacted for participants and also ways of maybe improving and repairing trust as well, which is both for people in addiction services and also for professionals working in relationship contexts as well.